where there are a few different political movements hoping to kind of answer to this rapidly changing society. And I want to talk to you about one of them today, and that's about the progressive movement and how it connects with the City Beautiful movement. This is a time at the turn of the century where there's a whole confluence of changing ideas about nature and about childhood, about the city, the effects of that environment upon citizens. I have to also confess here too, I'm sneaking in a little bit. You said it's about nature, and I'm also making it a little bit about cities, because I think there's an interesting dialectic between those two ideas. This is a time where, especially for those living in the poorest and the most overcrowded quarters of the city, there was a real urgency for some kind of relief, both economic and kind of a social relief from that. That leads to a drive among progressives for a provision for parks, for development of summer camps for underprivileged youth. And all of these come together under a bigger constellation of movements that are, I think, really can kind of be pinpointed on that acute sense of the absence of nature in the modern city. So it's that thing which is not quite there anymore. And you can see this in a few different places. You see it reflected in the City Beautiful movement. You can also see it reflected in the establishment of the national parks, which occurs again at the same historical moment as well, and a drive to establish municipal playgrounds. If you played on a playground as a kid, you can thank the progressives. That's an idea that they really brought to the foreground. Each of those was really an attempt to systematically set aside undeveloped land for the purpose of recreational or aesthetic use. And that's pretty key. That's not monetized use. That's not use value. That's setting aside something for aesthetic, for recreational use. This happens at the same time that the conservation movement is coming into full swing, and really trying to locate, kind of put scare quotes around it, the natural, what is nature, figure out what it is and preserve it from the predations of capitalism, as these large cities are kind of rolling out over their landscapes. Progressives in cities like Chicago, which is the locale for most of my talk today, although we've got a kind of nice connection to Seattle, so we'll bring that in as well. They're using some of that very same rhetoric to advocate for public spaces that can serve the need of an increasingly heterogeneous population. In Gebser's terms, I think the best way to think about this, again, forgive me, I look forward to your comments to kind of refine my thinking on this, is to think of the industrialized city as a perspectival space, but as a space that is a deficient mental rational one. In the cities in the early 20th century, it seems like they are sort of this machinery that's fed by this endless supply of resources, the bounty of natural resources coming in from the country's interior, and a seemingly endless stream of willing immigrants who are coming into the country to work in industry. So what I want to argue here is that progressives and the City Beautiful movement are part of a kind of intervention to reassert that mythical dialectic between nature and the city onto that highly rationalized space, by way of recognizing that there is a kind of reconnection to be made to the natural world, and especially for children. Children are kind of an interesting factor in this story as well. As people began increasingly to fear that many children were losing their childhoods to the factory floor, basically, or to dangerous and dirty spaces that were left on the margins of these industrialized cities, places that were ruled more by the logic of capitalism than by a concern for those individual children. So since I'm an art historian, I love pictures, and so I've got lots of pictures for you today. Urban parks in America began as part of this late 19th century attempt to compensate for those imbalances between industrialization and urbanization and that natural space. In Chicago, the establishment of parks and playgrounds has really been shown to be a major legacy of the city's progressive movement, progressive political movement in that city. This is the same city that had seen just in the year 1900, the permanent reversal of the flow of the Chicago River. Wrap your brain around that for a second. That blows me away a little bit. Through a feat of civil engineering. So this is a highly managed space, a space where nature has been made to answer to the needs of humans. Chicago's progressives, Jane Addams, key among them, brought to Chicago this idea, an English idea, of the settlement house. These settlement houses were a means of bringing education and expertise into the most beleaguered parts of the city. It brought college-educated men and especially women. This is an era where there are increasing numbers of women achieving a college education, but very few career options for them. Brings them into this space in the center of the city to work to help ameliorate the poverty of those urban slums. And here's where there's a kind of historical argument that I want to sort of give you a perspective on. Historians love to argue about things, maybe folks in your various disciplines do too. Historians have a lot of conflict over what the progressives did and what it meant. And many feel that they had a sort of controlling or paternalistic take on these folks that they came in to help, and that they were looking to sort of reshape folks in their own image. That is definitely a part of what's happening there, but I also want to kind of give them credit for the fact that they're looking to kind of roll up their sleeves and deal with social ills that other folks were willing to sort of turn a blind eye to. They are clearly a group of people who are very sincere in their efforts. What's interesting is that many of them, though they go and they actually live in spaces like Hull House, and by the end of the progressive movement, pretty much every major city in the United States had a settlement house. So this is something that became a feature of city life in America. These college-educated folks felt that it was probably necessary for them to leave those cities for an extended vacation, especially during the hot summer months, to rejuvenate themselves. This idea of they needed a vacation away from that space that they had come into to help fix, to help make better, but that their own health depended on exposure to the country, to fresh air, to kind of recharge. So it's a kind of interesting kind of natural progression, if you think about that, that felt necessity for exposure to nature, to rejuvenate, to kind of recharge yourself, that they would start to apply that to the folks that they had come to assist, to these working families, to young children who were caught in the worst slums of American cities. It's a pretty natural step for them to begin to arrange extensive outings to the countryside for tenement dwellers. That was something they started to do. And then to go on to try to make better recreational spaces within the city. And then finally, the last step in this process is to develop rural campgrounds that catered specifically to the urban poor. Settlement workers felt like parks could provide relief for mothers of small children. If you've had small children in an enclosed space, you know exactly what I mean. They also felt like this could help bring down the rates of juvenile delinquency. Here's a kind of telling quote from one of these settlement workers, a woman named Jane Robbins. She says, "If we want decent adolescent boys, we must give playgrounds to 10-year-olds." I think that's incredibly insightful, that there has to be a space for these children to roam around and create those kind of social relationships. The first playground in Chicago is a direct result of the efforts of Jane Addams and her partner at Hull House, Ellen Gebser. What happened was a property adjacent to the settlement house, which was the sort of mansion of a friend of Jane Addams's. Her family was well-to-do in Chicago. The family had decided that property probably wasn't rentable anymore because the slum had kind of emerged around it, and sort of let her rent it for a nominal fee. She and Gebser noticed that the property next door had just kind of fallen into disrepair. It's one of these, if you've been in a city, one of these blighted urban lots. It had several dilapidated buildings. It was really unsafe, unsanitary. And they were disturbed by what they saw as a dangerous eyesore right next to their settlement house. But they saw in that an opportunity to create a recreational area outdoors for those same neighborhood children that they were looking to serve. Florence Kelly, another woman coming out of the settlement movement, one of those people who really founds the profession of social work, wrote to the owners of the property asking that they tear down the buildings and allow a playground to be built. Imagine doing that to one of the blighted spaces that maybe you drive by and walk by. And surprisingly, the owners accepted. They accepted her offer, and the site was just the first of a number of city playgrounds and parks that the progressive movement got behind. I love this advertisement. This is for the opening of that first playground, and there's a great quote there. I don't know how well you can read it. The air is warm, the skies are clear, birds and blossoms are all here. Come old and young, with spirits gay, to welcome back the charming May. Right? It's this very playful, but this very older kind of sense of getting back in touch with the seasons and making that available to these children who probably had very little access to this kind of spaces. Legislation really strengthens that movement that Gebser and Adams get started. And there starts to come into view this idea of a park-studded city, a kind of ideal, right? And if you imagine yourself living in a city, it probably is something pretty appealing as well. Just 2 years prior to that successful playground, Illinois had put together the Act of June 19th, 1893. These always have fascinating names, right? And it provided a means for adjacent cities or villages to connect via a shared parks district. Again, if you're thinking of land as a kind of commodity, something that can be used for monetary use, this is pretty surprising, a surprising intervention. There's an act that follows it just 2 years later that allows for the acquisition for land for parks, either via purchase or condemnation. So that builds on kind of that successful experience that Adams and Gebser had, that if owners have just let a property fall into disrepair, if it's condemned, the city can take that property and turn it into a park. It set up provisions for bonds and special assessments to pay for any kind of acquisition or improvements. And there's finally, by 1907, there's another act that gives the right to maintain, purchase, or condemn for suburban authorities. So now, not just in that inner ring of an urban development, but to those outer suburban developments. So long as those parks were 10 acres or less. That's a kind of interesting bit that you might think about. We'll talk about that in a minute. But the speed and the definitiveness with which those lawmakers act, I think speaks to a moment when people are really willing to remake cities. And it's also pretty remarkable in the case of Chicago, when you think of its recent history coming up into this period. Of course, in 1871, the city was devastated by the Great Chicago Fire. In the years that followed, it was troubled by very frequent bread riots and further unrest. It had become a dangerous, we think of a kind of Blade Runner space. Chicago, after the fire, had elements of that, very threatening kind of city that is on the edge. There was further workers' unrest until that escalated in the Haymarket Riot of 1886. These are all things that you may know from American history. Finally, the Depression of the 1890s really devastated property values. Yeah.
Can I just interject, having lived in Chicago for 25 years, that after the fire, when Daniel Burnham redesigned the city, and I think this is where the park movement got started. He specifically said we have to keep the lakefront open to everybody. Exactly. And so the entire lakefront, you could not develop it commercially. It is one big park.
Right, and that's why the fire is such an important turning point.
Yeah.
The fire provides an opening, and thank you for remarking on that. It provides an opening for kind of safeguarding some of those spaces and for thinking differently about it. But after 50 years of urban and industrial growth, it takes some further shocks to kind of get people to reconsider public life. Middle class and upper class Americans were also pretty disturbed about the presence of machine politics in cities like Chicago, New York. This is also a part of that landscape. And they were really concerned about maintaining traditional values in those spaces. To give cities this is in the voice of one of those reformers, a quote, concept of the public good. That if we're going to build these spaces, it also reflects on us as civic beings and our idea of what is good. Divisions between workers and employers have grown particularly sharp. And so that sense of civic investments that's put into the idea of the public park, I think really speaks to a new kind of commitment to public spaces. Before considering those spaces specifically, I think it's pretty revealing to read the descriptions of late 19th and early 20th century cities, and Chicago in particular. Historian William Cronin remarks that there was a kind of ongoing dialogue between the place we call city and the place we call country, that there's a kind of networking between them, and that there was an urban empire that was really transforming the countryside. At that intersection, the kind of changes that were wrought on the natural world by the city's advance were both palpable and disturbing. In Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, he has would-be stockyard workers riding into the city from the train, and here's a quote from the novel. He says, "They noticed the perplexing changes in the atmosphere. It grew darker all the time, and upon the earth the grass seemed to grow less green. From the tall chimneys came smoke as thick and oily as might have come from the center of the world, where the fires of the ages still smolder." Kind of amazing description. That asphyxiating smoke is another kind of motif among Sinclair and his contemporaries. Another a diarist who lived in Chicago, Waldo Frank, wrote in his diary that it blanketed the prairie, he says, this fall of filth, like black snow, a storm that does not stop. So this is an environment that's kind of in crisis. Even the charter of the Chicago Public School Art Society, they maintain, albeit in kind of bureaucratic, genteel language, that artwork should be available in classrooms so that children would know, and here's their quote, that towns need not be ugly, all towns have not always been so, rivers are not all black, and bridges may be at once serviceable and not unsightly. So a real effort to give people a vision of a natural and visual world that is quite different from the one that is overtaking their city. Those are the crowds coming to the World's Fair, and then the stockyards made famous by Sinclair. The top is one of these kind of subsidiary canals that came to be called Bubbly Creek, that was known for being a place where the city's sewage kind of collected in one space. So these are really devastated environments that seem to have very little to do with nature. So on to that city of black rivers where grass that grew underfoot was barely green, to use that quote. The stifling air chokes you with a storm of filth. Chicago's progressives really hope to map a kind of ideal space of civic engagement. Jane Addams became very disgusted with local corruption, and she writes, and this is kind of characteristic for her, in that emphasis on community and also self-reliance. Here's her quote: "We are all involved in this political corruption. As members of the community, we stand indicted. This is the penalty of a democracy, that we're bound to move forward or retrograde together. None of us can stand aside. Our feet are mired in the same soil and our lungs breathe the same air." So she sees a real connection between the community and the larger political and social ideals. This is where a lot of historians have come in to kind of criticize that progressive concern, to say that it's really masking a kind of wished for social control, that the we that Addams is talking about is kind of a dream of a morally cohesive city. According to that argument, progressives are really just kind of assuming their own cultural and maybe even racial superiority and seeing themselves as the custodians of order. But to kind of put aside those concerns about paternalism or about their motives, that focus on the public good is important. And it does envision a good that's there for all of society, something that cuts across class and embraces political, social, and intellectual ideas that promise, again in Adams's word, the upgrading of national life, especially in its urban expression. But this is a hope for something better. Key to that is upgrading and making the city more livable. That's the kind of problem at hand. For progressives, looking at those social problems, especially overcrowding, was their primary concern. Crime, disease, death, all seem to come from that root cause of congestion, of packing people into these tight quarters. And by moving the causality of poverty onto that environment, that shifts the way you look at that problem. It starts to make the problem of the slums seem solvable. It seems like if you can fix that environment enough, you will solve those larger problems. Florence Kelly, again, acted both in Chicago and New York. This is a quote from her. She says, instead of assenting to the belief that people who are poor must be crowded, why did we not see years ago that people who are crowded must remain poor? That space is going to shape your destiny in a way that is kind of regardless of your own personal direction. So far from a kind of abstracted emphasis on community that some historians have used to call progressives intellectual adolescence. I think, again, it's kind of, you can always find threads that stretch to the present day, right, where people hope for a change for the better, and they get kind of smacked down as having an intellectually adolescent idea. It allowed for a sharper focus on the environment and for the development of some solutions. So among those solutions is the development of parks and playgrounds. Overcrowded for its poorer residents, but smoky and overbuilt for everyone. They seem like a kind of logical antidote to some of those ills. Historian William Cronin has noted that this is during the same years, and also in Chicago, that an American historian named Frederick Jackson Turner delivered a keynote at a meeting of historians called The Significance of the Frontier in American History. And I'd like to just kind of insert a bit on that here to sort of give you the larger lay of the land. In this essay, he declares that the closure of the frontier is kind of presenting the United States with a critical moment. He says, the advance of the frontier has meant steady movement away from the influence of Europe, a steady growth of independence on American lines. That, in other words, having that open frontier space has been where Americans have consistently and constantly recreated themselves as Americans. He writes this keynote as a kind of plea, a kind of note that the frontier doesn't exist any longer by 1893, as far as he's concerned. This would have really caught the interest of progressives who are dreaming of that morally cohesive populace, people who are no longer subject to their own racial or cultural baggage, but can recreate themselves. And Turner's argument is that out of that struggle with wilderness, and that's one vision of nature, right? That out of that come hardy Americans, the kind who have built the country as it is. But again, this is a message delivered by Turner because he feels like that safety valve is no longer there. It does mirror in certain ways Adams's idea that in a democracy, we all sink or rise together. So something needs to be done for that communitarian spirit to be fostered. That idea especially would resonate with folks in a city like Chicago, which had a large population of immigrants. And that idea of removing people from that degraded environment takes on a new kind of urgency after the publication of Jacob Riis' book of photographs, How the Other Half Lives. Again, this is within the same 5-year period. That critique only gains more strength as more sociological studies were released. Scholar Linda Nash has written that, especially before the popularization of germ theory, that germs are what cause disease, she says it was understood that places could alter bodies as much as bodies could alter places, that feedback loop is a tight one. That idea is very much in the mind of reformers like Riis. He makes the connection himself when he notices that there's a reduction of crime in the Mulberry Bend district of New York after his expose and after a certain kind of cleanup. His quote, he says, the most reasonable explanation for that reduction of crime may well be that the city dweller feels he's resting upon a certain obligation not to disgrace its traditions. The mental suggestion may be destroyed with the physical surroundings. He says it must also be the case that criminal association, like the pneumonia bacillus, though very destructive where it thrives, is feeble and doesn't easily survive a change of environment. So again, if those spaces have a kind of toxicity that reshapes us, cleaning up those spaces can solve larger social ills. And that confirms Nash's contention, that the body can only kind of temporarily or incompletely be removed from the environment in that pre-germ theory kind of idea. So adding parks, adding green belts would be one way. It's difficult to explain in the terms of a kind of perspectival view of the city that consumes, that rationalizes. But it makes a whole lot of sense in a more mythic kind of consciousness that sees bodies and nature as being conjoined. I think you can find a way to think about this as a sense of consciousness as well. If you think about the fact that many cultures the world over have the idea of a sacred grove or a large wooded tract that's left untouched, intentionally undeveloped, adjacent to or within a city. These are places that an offering to gods can be made, that can be important for coming of age rituals. And I think it's interesting to note that that overlay of mythic consciousness might explain the development of national parks as well. That notion resonates really well. By 1920, there were 16 of them. That includes, Yellowstone, Yosemite, Denali, the Grand Canyon, locally Mount Rainier. This idea that creating a space within nature that is preserved from humans has a kind of spiritual function. So coexisting with that idea of city spaces as physically ill, housing that kind of bacillus, that germ of criminality, and a kind of nostalgia for the vanishing frontier, you can put into the midst of that the City Beautiful movement. It recasts issues of aesthetics, zoning, and planning as sociological issues, not purely issues dealing with our architecture and development. One proponent of it, a man named Charles Mulford Robinson, he says, "He who makes the city makes the world, for he makes the environment of these the world's workers. And if this environment is lovely and uplifting or mean and depressing, it feeds or starves the brains or spirits whose outlook on the earth it encompasses." Again, that very strong connection between humans and their surroundings. There are a lot of overtones there of how the city makes the citizens and community, and how that progression up or kind of stagnation within really depends on the site. So this is Frederick Law Olmsted and Calvin Bow. This is their plan for exactly that City Beautiful movement that preserves those parklands alongside the river, again, because of that kind of opportunity provided by the fire. What kind of environments would be the most uplifting was incredibly clear to proponents and supporters of the City Beautiful movement. Robinson goes on to argue in favor of very large parks. He says, here's a quote from him, "They should have a complete natural landscape that should enclose a topographical unit. If an arbitrary frame is apparent, the charm of the scene is lost. So they should look natural, even though they are an imposition on the land. No city dweller, no small element in the park's attractiveness is its impression of spaciousness. So to create an environment that feels spacious and natural. As an antidote to the overcrowding in the built environment, these parks were supposed to highlight nature and the openness of nature. The landscape architect who worked on these projects, again, in the words of Robinson, should be content to lose his work his own identity. He should serve nature without an assertion of himself. His mind must always be on the distant picture that nature has sketched, and that he with her aid shall finish, not today nor tomorrow, but in the years to come. So this idea that you're building an environment that will far outlive you. So your hand should not be terribly visible within it. And these are just the kind of landscapes you see in the parks here that are an important part of the legacy of the City Beautiful movement. Frederick Law Olmsted, the architect of Central Park, among other major undertakings, was the principal landscape architect of the World's Columbian exhibition, which also arrived in Chicago during this era in 1893. To do his work there, he had to take on a vast overhaul of what had been considered to be one of the city's waste spaces, a space that could never really be fixed or ameliorated. Olmsted engineered surroundings there to be as beautiful and natural as possible. So in keeping with that typical City Beautiful aesthetics. He didn't like the idea of small, brightly colored plantings. He thought that was garish. He wanted to see larger plantings of native plants rather than specimens. He says he wanted an overall effect of luxuriant growth. This fits really nicely, again, with that progressive ideal of combining the ideological and the instrumental. And a lot of historians have considered Olmsted to be a kind of middle ground between conservationists like John Muir, who had a notion of nature as something sacred, and more pragmatic environmentalists like Gifford Pinchot, who thought that we were to be kind of custodians, to cut forests in a way that served our needs, but preserved the forest for later use. Olmsted wasn't averse to shaping the landscape as he pleased, but in his case, toward a place for relaxing contemplation. I think this is a sort of beautiful quote of his. He says, unlike the artificial pleasures that cities offered, natural scenery can refresh both mind and body. Again, it's much like those progressive reformers who go off to the country for the summertime. Purposefully hiding the designer's hand underscores the importance of viewing that site as an antidote to the built environment, as something opposite of that. It's a pretty common conceit among Olmsted and his followers. The idea that you could refine nature to become a product of both God's providence, this is a quote from him again, and artful human construction. Humans working together in a kind of mythical way with a deity. They could contain attractive footpaths that lead enticingly into the mysteries of planting that appeal resistlessly to an instinct for discovery. Isn't that nice? As well as secluded nooks and recesses everywhere and an invitation to idle daydream. That seems to me to be emblematic of a kind of mythical consciousness. He also, by creating these spaces, fits in with what a lot of progressive reformers were concerned about, that these could be spaces for the family. As more and more workers found that they had Sundays off, they could use these as places to go and enact family life and have a kind of pleasant afternoon that a park would provide. I want to wrap up here. I'm going to skip a couple. This fits in again, too, with an idea that the progressives had, that urban life in cities had taken away from that key structure of the family. The idea that it's not humanity that created the family, but in a real sense, a family that creates humanity. And the family requires those kind of natural spaces. I'm going to wrap up there instead of getting myself over time. Thank you very much.
About 7 full minutes for question and discussion.
Just a quick question. How does this tie in with the Plains progressive movements on the North Plains?
So you mean the political movement of progressivism? Yeah. It connects exactly. Jane Addams was one of the most important political progressives in her city. She came to it from that social kind of aspect, but by World War I, she is kind of assertively political. She was anti-war, despite the fact that that took a lot of her benefactors, kind of made them sort of distance themselves from it. So it's absolutely connected within that. Yeah.
A comment, the Olmsteds developed that marvelous system in New York and Seattle. So the little map I gave you yesterday, I didn't call your attention to it, but I took my green pencil and
I don't want to hand these out too. You can just
and that, well, some of the old homesteads were there. So I wanted you to be very aware that Seattle has an extensive park system. And some of the parks, when you're in the park, you have no idea you're in an urban environment. The trees are 500 years old. I mean, you're an incredible environmental. And so the walk that you're scheduled for you tomorrow, that's one of the things that you'll be walking along some very incredible trees and designated historic trees, also planted by the Olmsteders.
Yeah, thank you for making that connection. Olmsted is responsible for San Francisco's Golden Gate Park as well.
Yes.
So yeah, I mean he's absolutely kind of the central figure.
I wanted to say that I so much appreciate the way that you are expanding a kind of sterile definition of nature as that which is not us.
Right.
And I wanted to reference somebody that I've been reading lately, who I'm sort of really fascinated by, Norman Gofchin,
Okay.
who is a philosopher who developed a notion of social ecology, in which he talks about first nature, that is sort of the evolution of organic life in concert with inorganic world. And then second nature, which has to do primarily with human life, as it develops, also evolves our social, political, cultural worlds. And the way in which second nature derives from first nature, and that they are not only codependent, but they mutually, the constant interaction. What you're talking about is such a completely conscious recognition of that, and it's very small. He talks about it in a sort of more global way. But especially now with so much of the ecology movement sort of focusing on, especially the notion of the Anthropocene, separating man from nature. And I like very much his ideas because it provides a space, a sort of platform for talking about us as an integral part of nature and our functioning as specifically natural when we're making cities.
Right.
So I mean, I really liked that. Thank you. I guess I just want to say thank you.
Yeah, no, I need to look up those ideas. I think that's really fascinating. Yeah.
I would somewhat amplify that by saying it seems that you're demonstrating how the move to create these natural spaces within cities mirrors or is mirrored by the move, the conservationist move, such as establishes national parks as these sort of pristine places.
Right.
And yet, what we do know is we have these very lyrical, highly romantic, mythic accounts of John Muir gazing into these meadows in Yosemite Valley and remarking on how it is so Edenic, when in fact those are fields that have been horticulturally crafted by Native Americans.
Absolutely.
For centuries.
Yeah.
Centuries.
Yeah.
And writing in 1893, or 3 years after Wounded Knee, which was referenced, it's all native land.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, there's.
And it's only through regaining that capacity of perceiving ourselves not as neither separate from nor simply in reciprocation with, but as individually, no matter where we are, expressing nature herself.
Right, yeah, there's been some really interesting writing on the way Native Americans in the Northeast had shaped that landscape very specifically with fire, and that after the demographic collapse of contact, that white settlers really benefited from that, and they saw it as being sort of God-given, but it was definitely created.
There were bison in the East Coast. Yeah. Followed grassland highways from the plains.
Right, absolutely.
Real quick, an extension, I think, of your entire presentation is happening in Detroit right now, which is really exciting because, the city went from a population of 2 million down to 700,000. Lots of, entire blocks where there's nobody living anymore. And they're reclaiming it with urban farmland and having to decontaminate, the soil. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's an amazing movement, and I've seen little bits of that as I've walked around Seattle too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we're just about out of time, but before we do the last one.
Thanks, Rebecca. That was really many years when I was practicing as an architect. Couple of things. One is architects, and I'm one of them, I used to be, notorious for designing for rather than designing with. And I'm just wondering, in your research and what you've done, if there is any more to do or to reveal about the architects and urban designers of that time that in fact really connected with clients.
Yeah.
With not designing for. That's one thing. And the other thing, very quickly, because I'm watching the part here, Jason is going to kick me out. That was different. The other one is, since we are in Gebser conference, I thought it would be a good idea. The whole notion of city movement, city beauty movement, or beautiful city, has a lot to do with sense of wholeness. And I'm just wondering if you pull something from Gebser into the work that you're doing, because beauty itself is an essential dimension of
wholeness.
Yeah, no, and that's something I was hoping that, some exposure to Gebser scholarship could help me sort of redefine, that there does seem to be a real rethinking of those spaces, not just in those progressive political terms, but in a very holistic kind of way. But I think that a connection back to those mythical sacred groves maybe gets us there. But thank you for that.
Okay, we're out of time.